Good morning. This is View from the Pew. It is Monday morning, September the 21st, and we're going to try to get back on the commands of Christ, but we're going to look at a parable today, and we're going to look at an implied command in that parable. But I want to read the whole parable to you and the verse that immediately follows, and maybe it'll help us to understand what the parable is saying. I want you to remember as you hear this parable, he's really talking straight to the Pharisees, a word of condemnation, and they realize this. It also speaks to the idea of being chosen, and this is, I believe, one of the first times you hear Jesus use the terminology of chosen when it comes to the Gospels. So I think it's really important that we begin to shape the idea of that in this area. If I were to give this parable an implied command, I'm walking with Jesus, I'm listening to this parable, I'm looking at the context of everything because I'm thinking he's saying this in the presence of some Pharisees. This is what I hear the command to be. Just because you're religious, don't think God's going to accept you in heaven. Just because you're religious, don't think God's going to accept you in heaven. And I think you'll see where I'm going when we get to the end of this. Jesus answered, this is verse 1 of chapter 22. Jesus answered and spoke to them again by parables and said, this is actually, it does say, he's specifically talking to the Pharisees because it said, now when the chief priest and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking of them. And so he spoke to them again by parables. So this is Jesus speaking to the Pharisees. And he says this, he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son. I think we can already draw some analogies here. The king is God, the son is Jesus. The marriage is the marriage supper of the Lamb. And sent out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, and they were not willing to come. A clear statement about going to the Jewish leadership, the Pharisees, and inviting them to come in and join him. Again, he sent out other servants saying, tell those who were invited, see, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and fatted calf are killed, or my fatted cattle, and all things are ready, come to the wedding. There's the invitation from Jesus, from God and Jesus, come join me. But they made light of it and went their ways, one to his own farm, another to his business, and the rest seized his servants. And he's going to get onto them in Matthew 23 about how even they persecuted the prophets. Seized his servants, they seized his servants, treated them spitefully, and killed them. But when the king heard about it, he was furious, and he sent out his armies, destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city. Then he said to his servant, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Now, why weren't they worthy? Because they didn't receive the message that was freely given to them, the invitation to come to the wedding. They didn't receive that, and they didn't take it and go with it. Now, notice what it says next. Therefore, go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding. This is a sense of God saying, now I'm turning to the world and inviting all of them, as many as I can find, to come to this wedding as well. So those servants went out into the highways and gathered together all whom they found, both bad and good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. And here's the kicker. But when the king came in to see the guest, he saw a man there who did not have on a wedding garment. I'm going to work from the assumption that he knew what he should have been wearing, because I'm going to trust, because of who the king represents, the king would be fair. So it surprised the king that he didn't have the garment on. So he said to him, friend, how did you come in here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot, take him away, cast him into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. And then it goes on to say in 15, you can't miss this. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. Don't miss that. He's talking to the Pharisees. He's talking about the Pharisees. They are not only the ones who beat the servants. They are not only the ones who ignore the message. they are also the ones who assume, because of their self-righteousness, that when they do come, that they'll be accepted like they are. And the king looks at them and says, why aren't you dressed appropriately for this event? Now, spiritually, what does that mean for us? It means if you want to come before God dressed appropriately, the wedding garments you are to wear is the clothing of Christ. It's to be clothed with Jesus Christ. Doesn't matter what your good works are in this life. Doesn't matter how religious you are. If you come to the wedding feast and you're not dressed in Jesus, you're going to be cast into outer darkness. So the command that I'm taking from this, looking at the context, Pharisees on the front end, Pharisees on the back end, and just a very clear word that he's given to them is, he's saying to them this, guys, you're religious, but you're off if you think when you stand before God one day, God's going to accept you for your religiosity, because he won't. You have to respond to the invitation and come dressed appropriately. So just because you're religious doesn't mean God's going to accept you into heaven. You've got to be clothed with Jesus Christ. And as a disciple of Christ, we need to not only preach that message, teach that message, we need to live that message and tell others that message. So I pray today as you share with others, share with them that the only suit that matters in heaven is wearing Jesus. And make sure that you are clothed with him when you stand before the Father, the King, one day. So I pray God gives you a great Monday. Pray God blesses you today. And praise God for the way he's made for us to this wedding feast through Jesus Christ. God bless.